Hi, everyone. Okay, it looks like we've got most people in now. So, as I said before, very good morning to you all. And thank you very much for joining us for the first Accentuate by K3 Hub webinar of 2024, where we'll be discussing Wednesday's spring budget. For those who haven't virtually met me before, my name is Marie Wadeson, and I'm a Managing Director at Quantuma. And on behalf of our parent company, the K3 Capital Group, I lead the K3 Hub, which is a member network for professional advisors developed by us and other companies within the K3 Capital Group. By way of a bit of background, K3 Hub launched in the spring of 2021, so we are approaching being 3 years old now. We're proud to have over 2,750 members. K3 Hub offers a range of CPD and training sessions which are not dissimilar to today's event, and referral fees for certain types of work referred into the group. Just a quick, it would be remiss of me not to say what our group does for those that don't know. So just as a quick summary, our group offers a wide range of niche advisory services, including restructuring, corporate finance, forensic accounting, R&D tax credits, and marketing services for professional services firms. Right, into a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway today. So whilst we do have a slide deck to support today's session, we're not going to be able to share it, I'm afraid. We are, however, recording today's session, and the recording will be placed on the K3 Hub website next week. So if you do wish to go back and refer to anything that Jeremy discusses today, that's where you'll need to go next week. Q&A function is open, so please do feel free to ask questions as we go. I'm going to be putting your questions to Jeremy at the end of today's session. So if your question relates to something that we talk about early doors, would you mind just giving me some context to the question, just because there's going to be a lapse of time before I put that to Jeremy for you. If you wouldn't mind as well, I'm not great at multitasking, so if you wouldn't mind using Q&A for your questions rather than the chat, just it saves me looking in two places later on, and I'd be very grateful to you for that. We are expecting a fair amount of questions today. Invariably, in that case, we might not be able to cover all of them. If that's the case, I will pop them over to Jeremy separately after the webinar for you. Right, on to today's webinar then in that case. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome back our very regular speaker, Jeremy Mindell, with whom we've worked for many years here at Quantuma. I'm sure most of you know Jeremy, but for those that don't, Jeremy has been lecturing in taxation for over 20 years and covers issues related to tax, pensions, share schemes, and remuneration. Right, that's all I've got to say. So, Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marie. So, the Wednesday budget, the spring budget, possibly almost certainly the last budget before the general election, and maybe the last financial statement, although I'll talk about that later on. And I would say that the main headline that I would be talking about would be Jeremy Hunt shoots Labour foxes, because this was a pre-election budget, not so much because of the giveaway, but because Jeremy Hunt either stole Labour's clothes or certainly curbed some of the elements that Labour were going to use in their manifesto. The most obvious one was the non-domicile changes, where a regime that has lasted over 2 centuries is coming to an end in 2025. And Rachel Reeves had said that this was going to be her centerpiece in terms of raising money for all sorts of things like breakfast clubs and other worthy causes, the £2 billion. And that was one of the major tax raising measures that she had promised. Well, Jeremy Hunt has taken that money and spent it on the national insurance decrease, which Labour have said they will not oppose. So given that, she will need to find the money from somewhere else. And certainly she had a somewhat less than comfortable interview on the Today programme that I heard yesterday, saying we'll go through every line of government expenditure and this is what and we will find that money for our priorities. But of course, you're then not finding it from non-UK domiciles who generally are not UK voters. You're finding it from other people, and that always gets more difficult. The other element he did was against the wishes of the Scottish Conservative Party, certainly the leader, that he extended the energy profits levy on fossil fuels and other elements of energy production for one further year, snaffled him another £1.5 billion. Again, going towards making sure that he reaches his fiscal rules. More about that later. So very much, and the energy profits levy was going to be, as I say, extended by the Labour Party to fund other projects. So it does leave them going, I won't say back to the drawing board, but certainly having to think hard about how do they fund their promises in the general election. They have promised that all their promises will be funded. We will know where the money comes from, but that has been made that much more difficult. The other element which I think is really important to understand is the big challenge to the economy. And the big challenge in terms of growth, getting the economy motoring along, producing higher standards of living for us all, and also funding the public services that we need whilst keeping taxes at a reasonable level. We have 8 million economically inactive people. And on that basis, that is probably the biggest challenge that the government faces at the moment. I think that this is probably a legacy of the pandemic. We are suffering in many different ways, whether it's economically, politically, socially, from long COVID. The effect of COVID has drawn a long shadow over the following 2 years. It's now over 2 years since the last restrictions were lifted. But if you look at the effects on mental health for young people, the effect of being cooped up for nearly 2 years, that's had an effect. It's had a disruptive effect on the labour market, and it has led to a level of economic activity which is quite astonishing in certain towns and cities. We're talking about 33%, plus a third of adults being economically inactive. If the UK economy is ever going to motor along at the sort of rates it did in the early part of this century, somebody has got to deal with that. One of the elements is that Jeremy Hunt has been very clear that he's focused on marginal rates of tax and national insurance rather than allowances. And the interesting element is that you look at the effect of the national insurance cut. If you're a basic rate taxpayer at 20%, and you'll pay 8% national insurance if your earnings go above 12,570, up to £50,270, the marginal rate is now 28%. Now, this is an interesting column source of the IFS. What you can see here is that the general trend has been for income tax rates to come down. Back in 1976, under Dennis Healey, income tax was at a rate of 35%, and national insurance was somewhere just above 5%, somewhere around 6%. Since then, income tax has come down. The basic rate has come down to 20%, where it's been for quite a long time, since Gordon Brown took the last 2p off down to 20p, while national insurance crept up and up and up and went as high as 13.25%. That was a relatively short period where NI was at 13.25%. You may recall it was supposed to fund social care. Since then, it came down by 1.25%. It then came down by another 2%, so down to 12, then down to 10%, and now down to 8%. And what you can see is that if you combine the two rates, the national insurance and the tax, they've now both been boosted to the level of 12,570. The threshold for national insurance was considerably lower, somewhere around £9,500. That has been boosted in the last few years to £12,570. So a boost in the threshold for NIC, not so much of a boost for tax. But what you can see is Jeremy Hunt making big inroads into the marginal rate of tax. And that has got to be part of his strategy to try and make work pay. And what you can see there is that the narrowing of the gap between tax and NIC has, for the moment, been reversed. And we are looking at a national insurance rate which has not been this low since the early 1980s. So last time I told you that the 10% rate, the last time we had 10% national insurance was back in 2003. The last time that we had national insurance as low as 8%, we're looking to the late 70s, early 80s on that basis. Even so, what you can see is the effect of the freezing of allowances, what is known as fiscal drag, which means allowances like the personal allowance, the high rate threshold band, are frozen supposedly till 2028. And on that basis, taxes as a proportion of the economy are still rising and will be above 38% potentially, which means as a share of the economy hasn't been this high since Clement Attlee was in office in the post-war austerity. The other element, which is, I think, very important, is that the economy is growing, but it's very slow. So 2023, we saw 0.3% growth. That was better than the IMF and the ABR had originally predicted. They thought that we would be actually have negative growth. We would be in a recession. There was a technical recession of 2 quarters, but very short, very shallow. And what we can see is the economy growing, albeit less than 1% this year, and then growing at a higher rate in 2025 and 2026. And then after that, I think any economic forecast is probably not worth the paper it's written on. As I said at the beginning, Jeremy Hunt has taken all the measures, including his tax-raising measures, and has effectively banked them against the national insurance reduction. There were very few other giveaways, nothing on inheritance tax, for example. And he said, right, I've taken all the money that I can from different sources, and we'll talk about some of the squeezes he's done, and he's banked it on national insurance, hoping that people will see an average of £900 in their pockets, more the combined effect of the 2 national insurance reductions, January and April. And on that basis, he's hoping that people will feel more well disposed toward the Conservatives come general election time. The problem is that we are based on economics. And one of the problems, as you may have heard me say before, is that economists give you what they consider very accurate predictions based on their spreadsheets. The only thing you can almost guarantee is that they're never right. This is by Tim Congdon, who sits outside the group think of most economists. He says, economists in the mass as a profession, no less, have not covered themselves in glory in the early 2020s. Like everyone, they were caught off guard by COVID, but they blundered in their reaction to it. With few exceptions, they forecast that COVID-19 would lead to years of disinflation, a reduction in prices, and perhaps even of deflation. Instead, in 2022, inflation reached the highest levels for 40 years. He then, another report which shows how difficult it is to get accurate economic forecasts on which the government should be able to depend. In its sensible report on the Bank of England in November last year, the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee, this is no bunch of headbangers from either the left or the right. This is a very solid, experienced group of people worried that the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, which sets interest rates, lacked sufficient intellectual diversity, i.e. groupthink. It recommended that the bank become proactive, encouraging a diversity of views and a culture of challenge. In other words, it's important to take on board different views and try and think, if all economists agree, you can almost guarantee it's wrong. And it really is quite important because the Bank of England sets interest rates, and bless them, the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, opines has become very important in terms of the parameters of what governments will do in their fiscal policy. You don't have to take my word. One of the most famous economists the UK has ever produced, John Maynard Keynes, said after who was a key economist in the 30s and 40s. Far too many economists think that if they write papers with algebraic squiggles, as in the above equations from Einstein and Boyle, their work constitutes scientific progress simply because they contain the algebraic squiggles. Keynes once said, if economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, that would be splendid. And my thought about it is that whilst the OBR produces interesting reports, my worry is that they're arrogating to themselves some of the roles of elected politicians, and their record in financial forecasting, in forecasting the size of the economy, and in the size of the state of public finances, which is their main job, has been woeful, and that is what the government is depending on. Let's look at some of the issues that came as a result. So in personal income tax, no changes to the allowance or rates in 24-25. And I think originally it was penciled in to have a 2p cut in income tax. But then when the OBR dramatically reduced the fiscal headroom that I talked about before, Jeremy Hunt went for the cheaper option of cutting national insurance and made a virtue of necessity of saying he thought that was a good idea because working people were taxed twice, income tax and national insurance, whereas others, landlords, people earning investment income, didn't suffer national insurance, and he felt that national insurance at its current level was a disincentive to work. He may be right about that, and I certainly think that bringing the marginal rate of tax down, that for every pound you earn above 12,570, you lose 28p rather than 33 or 34p, I think that is a very good thing to do. But I think he was making a virtue of necessity on there. Notice that the personal allowance has been frozen. A change which may be popular with Middle England and Middle Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland: high income child benefit charge, income threshold before a clawback increases to £60,000. And then the clawback is spread over £20,000, not the current £10,000. At the moment, if you have 3 children of child benefit age, where you could claim child benefit, you are facing between £50,000 and £60,000, a marginal rate of 67%. This will reduce substantially on the basis of the new rules. And then from 6th of April 2026, he's then looking at household income. So that's going away from independent taxation rather than the high income generator. At the moment, at the current situation as we speak at the moment, if both parents earn £50,000, they get the full child benefit. If one parent owns £60,000, they get none of it. So at the moment, a household could earn £100,000 and lose no child benefit, whereas a single individual with £60,000 loses the lot, and they're looking to change that system. A new British ISA introduced. The UK ISA will be available to UK investors to invest up to £5,000 as long as the fund only invests in UK listed companies. Now, this is part of the reforms that were pushed at Mansion House and indeed by the Lord Mayor to try and encourage more UK investment in UK industries. Other countries have similar arrangements. So this is a recognition of the UK, if you like, catching up on that basis. And that means the ISA limit will go up to £25,000 rather than the £20,000 it's been for a number of years. This is an interesting policy. Normally, a tax rising policy does not give you a lot of votes, but this is partially due to the pressure that allegedly second homes have put on properties in seaside resorts in Devon and Cornwall. For over 40 years, the furnished holiday lets have had tax privileges, capital gains tax at potentially a lower rate, the ability to claim capital allowances, and full interest relief on the mortgages or on loans taken out to purchase furnished holiday lets or improve them, unlike buy-to-lets. So from 6th of April 2025, these rules will change, and they will be treated the same as buy-to-lets. And anti-forestalling rules from the 6th of March 2024 to prevent the use of unconditional contracts to obtain relief under the current rules. The issue is going to be that a lot of landlords thought about converting properties into short-term lets. They don't have to be in holiday locations in order to continue to access full interest relief. This will not be available from April 2025 and will snaffle the Treasury allegedly about £300 million. As I say, second homeowners are not necessarily terribly popular, so abolishing the relief may be seen as quite popular in constituencies in Cornwall and the like, where locals feel they're being priced out by second homes. In terms of the consequences, properties will no longer qualify for business asset disposal relief, replacement of business asset relief, nor gift relief. And we may see some disposals before the 6th of April 2025 because of this. And I think that it will be interesting. It's yet another squeeze on landlords. And with the reduction in the capital gains tax rate to 24%, top rate for residential properties, is pushing landlords to the exit to exit the sector. Let's look at capital taxes. So there was quite a lot of discussion before the budget about potential changes to inheritance tax. And I, for one, if I'd been Chancellor, would have been very tempted to halve the rate, because that would have reduced the attractiveness of inheritance tax planning and might have meant that actually the Treasury didn't lose much money, whilst posing the opposition quite an issue, a challenge in terms of what would they say about IHT. IHT regularly comes up as one of the most unpopular taxes, so you might have thought he might have done something about it, but nothing done much. On CGT, however, a surprise, the higher rate of CGT on disposal of residential property falls from 28% to 24% from the 6th of April 2024. Rather surprisingly, the basic rate at 18%, so where you've got your total income and gains are within the 50270 bracket, or at least part of the gains being the top slice are within the 50270 bracket. So if you've got income of 40,000, you get just over £10,000 at the basic rate, and this is at 18%. Notice that the carried interest gains for private equity is still charged at 28%, and that's an area that Labour have said if they get in, they would charge carried interest gains at the full income tax rate, which is one of their proposals, where there is still a substantial difference between the political parties. An area, multiple dwellings relief. So Jeremy had a bit of fun about this. So multiple dwellings relief where you buy several properties or maybe an annex to an existing property, lots of cases in the courts, you'll no longer get the reduced rate of stamp duty land tax. I think sooner or later somebody has got to review SDLT, because at the rates they are, it's definitely a discouragement to mobility of people and indeed land transactions. So sooner or later somebody is going to revise SDLT and is going to think, how do I reduce the economic damage that might be done on this by this very high level of stamp duty? And I think that, as say, multiple dwellings relief, one of the reliefs that people looked at, a lot of cases in the courts, generally HMRC wins them, but they've decided just to abolish it altogether. Other changes on SDLT from the 6th of March, first-time buyers relief will be available where the property is acquired by the trustees of a bare trust or a nominee. The 15% SDLT rate for companies purchasing residential properties with a value of more than £500,000 will exclude companies that are public bodies. So one of the disadvantages of incorporating is you then buy a property, you're likely to be have to pay SDLT at 15%. They're now excluding public bodies from this. Inheritance tax changes. So this one was looked at on, was announced before, but just a reminder that agricultural property relief and woodlands relief is now going to be limited to land located in the UK. It used to be in the European Economic Area. They are now limiting the relief to UK land only. But it will also be available. Agricultural property relief gives you relief from inheritance tax, and relief will be available for land managed under an environmental agreement or on behalf of the UK government or other devolved bodies. And this is for agreements in place on or after the 6th of March. So this is encouraging environmental land management and getting APR on that, even if it's not primarily being used for agriculture. Interesting enough, it's one of the areas that was in today's papers as one of the areas that Labour Party may want to review in terms of the reliefs given. And then we get to the real shooting of the fox, which is the reform of UK domicile rules. Now, having started off in an expatriate tax department and had to get used to domicile rules, the foreign emoluments deduction, there was always a lot of talk about changes to this, because it's based on long-term intentions, where your centre of vital interests are, where your attachment is to a place. It was always more nebulous, difficult to work out, and huge numbers of court cases on this. Jeremy Hunt claimed that the late, great Nigel Lawson, the last real, in my view, substantial tax reformer who did budget changes for real reasons of tax reform, who died last year and was Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1983 to 1989, he also thought about junking the UK domicile rules and bringing rules based just on residence. As you know, the Labour Party were determined to do this, and they were going to fund all sorts of interesting ideas from it. But Jeremy Hunt got in there first. The reform of the non-UK domicile tax regime, remittance basis for non-UK domiciled individuals abolished and replaced by a simpler residence-based regime, take effect from not this tax year, but next tax year. To me, that makes sense. The remittance basis, where you're taxed on foreign earnings if you bring them into the UK, was a nightmare. Always has been. When I started off my career, I remember a case of somebody, a rich person from the Middle East, where HMRC had opened up an inquiry, and this just went on and on and on. Individuals who opt into the regime will not pay UK tax on foreign income and gains for the first 4 years of tax residence, as long as they were non-resident for the last 10 years, which means that Brits could benefit from this. Temporary 50% exemption of foreign income for the first year, 25-26, and a 2-year repatriation facility where the remittance-based tax paid prior to 6th of April to 2025 to bring accrued foreign income into the UK. That will only be charged at 12%. So what happens at the moment is if you have income that would be taxed if it is remitted to the UK, you can never bring it into the UK unless you invest under the business investment relief system, or you're away from the UK non-resident for 5 consecutive years. That money would always be tainted money and would always need to be kept abroad. Now, to encourage money into the UK, they're going to give you a special rate for 2 years to repatriate that money into the UK, and you would only pay 12% tax on those remittances. They're also reforming overseas workday relief based on the new regime, because at the moment you have to be non-UK domiciled to get OWR. It'll still be for 3 years where your overseas earnings will be excluded, but this is based on workday relief. So let's say I had 48 days abroad out of 240. That would mean that 20% of my income, if I was earning £100,000, £20,000 would not be subject to UK tax. And the advantage now is that I'll be able to bring that money into the UK. Previously, if I'd had a salary of £100,000 and I had 48 days outside the UK, I would have £20,000 would not be subject to tax in the UK if it's in those first 3 years, but I can bring the 20,000 into the UK. Now you'll be able to bring that money into the UK and you won't suffer tax on it. There'll also be a residence regime will also be introduced for IHT, and the proposal was for a 10-year exemption period for new arrivals, which could mean that if you're a Brit who's been abroad for 20 years and comes back, you'll still get the 10-year exemption. And then a 10-year tail provision for those who leave the UK and become non-resident. You will still be liable to IHT on your worldwide assets if you die within 10 years. If you die after 10 years after leaving the UK, then you'd only be taxable to IHT on your UK status assets. So the biggie, national insurance. So what we're looking at, cut again to 6% for, class 1, cut again on that basis. It's not from, it's the 6%. Class 4 NIC main rate also falls from 9% currently to 6%. Consultation later this year on abolishing Class 2 national insurance. Sorry, that's wrong. It should be, Class 1 primary NIC falls from 10% to 8% in the year. Consultation later this year on abolishing Class 2 NIC as well. So that's a big change on that basis. And what you will see is that still the differential between Class 4 and Class 1, that's at 8%, not 6%. So it's currently at 10, was at 12, moved from 12 to 10, and then 10 to 8. The other element is on this, that obviously national insurance is levied on a smaller element of people's income. It is not levied on rents. It's not levied on pensioners or pensions. It's not levied on dividends. So the cut is less costly to the government and does concentrate on helping earners. On corporation tax, there's little change. What we're looking at there is full expensing relief for leased assets. So draft legislation shortly on whether to extend full expensing. So now you buy plant and machinery, you can get full expensing without limit on the value of the plant and machinery you buy. So treating it pretty much like revenue expenditure. This cost the government in the November statement a cool £9 billion or so, and is designed to help encourage British industry to retool. Also been some changes to the audio-visual expenditure credit. So visual effects costs will not be capped at 80% and will qualify for a tax credit of 39%. A new independent film tax credit aimed at films that have budgets for total core expenditure of up to £15 million, and they receive a new accreditation from the British Film Institute. The credit rate will be 53% of qualifying expenditure. There've also been some, again, restrictions, which mean expenditure has to be predominantly in the UK rather than anywhere over the European Economic Area. And this is, again, trying to boost an industry in which the UK does excel at. So rather than trying to prop up industries that are declining, looking at an area where the UK is a leader and trying to make it bigger. Also changes to cultural reliefs, permanent 40 to 45% credits in exchanges for losses surrendered for non-touring and touring and orchestral productions, and also for theatre tax relief, orchestra tax relief, and museums and galleries exhibition tax relief, which was temporary and now will be permanent. And that rate is from 1st of April 2025. Again, an area supporting an area which the UK has makes a lot of earnings from. R&D, I know that many members of the K3 are involved in R&D, so HMRC will establish an expert advisory panel to support the administration of R&D reliefs. And this is partly because there have been so many investigations in this area that they feel it necessary to get an expert panel. A bit like they have the British Film Institute to help them on cultural reliefs, they need a new panel of scientists to help them with R&D. In terms of other taxes, other shooting the acquiring a Labour policy, the EPL will be extended for 1 further year to March 2029. And if you wonder why announce it now, well, if you're trying to say that I'm going to have debt falling as a proportion of GDP within the next 5 years, one way of trying to do that is to get an extra 1.5 billion by extending the EPL. Whether that's a good idea or not, whether it'll affect North Sea investment remains to be seen. Also, economic crime levy will increase. This is a levy not on economic crime, but on firms, large firms, to support the measures to crack down on economic crime. Indirect taxes, one of the big changes, well, reasonably big change, was the first time in about 7 years we saw the VAT threshold increase from £85,000 to £90,000. The Office for Tax Simplification had actually thought about decreasing it to £25,000 because there's a worry that there's a cliff edge, that some businesses keep their turnover deliberately below the VAT threshold in order VAT threshold in order to avoid the complications of VAT. Well, you'd have thought the obvious thing is to try and simplify VAT, but no, the government has decided what they should do is go back to increasing the registration threshold on that basis. And there are also some changes to the DIY builders where a house builder can get 0 rating on building their own house. some changes to the regime there. Changes to tobacco, where again there's going to be a big increase in tobacco duty. You do wonder whether this is just a boon to smugglers, but probably more welcome is the alcohol duty freeze until 1st of February 2025, which is conveniently after the general election. You will see, I suspect, again, some easing up on alcohol to try and support the very heavily pressed pub sector. So what in the last couple of minutes about the politics of this? Clearly, we are in election mode, and a number of the policies, I think, like the non-UK domicile policy, would probably have not happened had Labour not raised this as a major issue. I think the politics are that Jeremy Hunt is trying directly to put money in the pockets of ordinary workers, as he would put it, rather than necessarily in the hands of pensioners, landlords, or high net worth individuals. And I suppose targeting it on national insurance is probably a good idea. It does leave some questions for the opposition about what they will do now. And it will be interesting to see whether the combined effect of the January and April reductions in national insurance from 12 to 10 and then 10 to 8 will actually change some of the political spectrum. It is very likely that there will be a general election in the autumn, and there may be a chance for a final autumn statement by the government before going into the general election. My guess is that there certainly will be pressure from Conservative backbenchers to see more movement on tax. There is also some discomfort about the fact that the current figures didn't allow for any real terms increase in defence expenditure, and one may see that addressed later on. This is, of course, the year of elections, and as I say, we've got the United States in November, the UK, the Indian, large, I think about 49% of the world's population is going to the ballot boxes this year. And I do wonder whether Jeremy Hunt has now left himself room that if the economic forecasts don't turn out as the OBR expects, that he might fit in an autumn statement with a very short finance bill before maybe a late November general election. It is possible, and it is a reminder, if a reminder is required, it is possible, and it is a reminder, if a reminder is required, in my view, that the government have the initiative. The government does things, and oppositions have to respond to them. And that's the advantage that governments have coming into a general election, and should not be underestimated, even though at this stage, Labour, with its commanding lead in the opinion polls, looks to be the favourite. The question would be, is can Labour seal the deal? And that remains to be seen. At this point, many thanks, and I'll hand back to Marie for any questions.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Right, I've a fair few questions for you to put you through your paces. So I will start at the beginning. We've got quite a lot of interest in furnished holiday lets, so that's where I'm going to start. So
yeah.
One of our questions asks, is it possible that the changes to FHLs will also mean that these properties now become exempt for VAT purposes?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's the government's intention, because it would depend on the range of services that you provide. So if I just provide let the property, then possibly. But if I'm providing a series of services as well, the answer to that would probably be no.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So, and I'm just going to read it as it's come in. So, what is likely to happen to capital allowance pools on FHLs? Do we think that these may need to be disposed as at 24-25?
Don't know is the answer to that.
In a word,
I would have thought there would be some transitional provisions on that. I'm sure we will see detail. Remember, it's 2025, so the government has got to publish the finance bill. It was only, floated as an idea about a week before the budget that this might happen. But I would have thought that there would be some transitional provisions in terms of capital allowances.
Lovely. Okay. Right. Next question. So, has the low salary and high dividends remuneration structure now changed in respect of the cuts in national insurance, and it may now be more preferable to adopt PAYE salaries instead?
It really depends. You've got a lot of moving parts on there. Clearly, a reduction in national insurance makes salary more attractive than it was when you do the comparison. But unfortunately, there's no substitute for crunching the numbers. In other words, you've got all sorts of things to look at. Do I get an employment allowance? What's my rate of corporation tax? Remember that between 50,000 and £250,000, I effectively have a marginal rate of 26.5%, which makes paying salaries which are deductible against corporation tax that much more advantageous, whereas at 19%, that may not be the case. You've got to look at the NIC status of the people you're paying. They could be over the state pension age and no NIC at all anyway. Or they could be young people, in which case maybe there's no secondary employer's NIC. I haven't crunched the numbers yet, but I suspect that there is still a point beyond which it may be a much higher figure, might be towards £20,000, where it's still better to pay dividends. But the gap is certainly narrowing for people who are not, very highly paid.
Okay, thank you for that. Back into furnished holiday lectures for a second. So, will there be any separation of the FHL rules for UK and non-EU properties, or are these likely to all fall under one category?
Properties abroad and in the UK fall under separate categories, whether they're FHL or not. So if I have a buy-to-let empire, for example, you're going to look at your properties abroad and in the UK separately. They're in separate pools. So FHLs will fall into the buy-to-let, and the UK and the foreign will be treated separately, I'm pretty certain, on that basis.
Okay, very good, thank you. Right, last question from our audience. I do have one that I'm going to hold back for you, but last question from our audience today. So, with the drop of Class 4 NIC to 6%, now clinch the argument to stay as a sole trader rather than incorporate for the small business, possibly even to revert back for those already working as a company with their tax rates approaching 25%?
I've always thought that for smaller businesses, the unincorporated route was better. It's only when businesses mature and you want to keep money within the business without taking out and paying higher rates of income tax that it suddenly becomes better to be incorporated. When you're controlling your income flow through salary and dividends and you want to avoid, say, the marginal rate of £100,000, then clearly a company with the vehicle to keep the money in the company is a better idea. But in terms of smaller businesses or businesses starting out or businesses with relatively small profits, unincorporated, a lot less administration, a lot less paperwork, and probably cheaper in terms of tax and national insurance. And I would be saying to people, well, what about unlimited liability? And I'm saying, well, the problem is that the protections that companies used to give to directors in terms of, limited liabilities, those have generally gone by the board. Corporate, if you do something wrong as a director, you're likely to be slapped with a personal liability notice these days, or you may have given bank guarantees. So I think the advantages of incorporation, both tax and non-tax, have become much less. And I would certainly say for businesses starting off, the unincorporated route is probably better from a number of standpoints. But yes, each time he reduces class 4, and it'll be goes down effectively, he left it at 9%, and until the end of the tax year, because class 4 is done on a tax year, he's now reducing it by 3% to 6%. That's going to be another factor to look into that. But yes, accountants will need to crunch the numbers on that.
Thank you for that very considered answer there. Just one thing that I'd like to flag to our audience before I do my sucker punch final question for you. That we've got a CPD session coming up on Friday the 15th of March that covers cash budgeting and short-term finance planning. If you haven't received your invite yet, or you've not seen any details about that, they will be winging their way to you. So do sign up for that if you get the opportunity. Jeremy, my final question to you, and one that will send us all into the weekend. You've already referred to the fact that we are in a sort of a pending election state as a nation. Let's have some predictions for the next budget. What is it going to say? More importantly, who is going to say it, and when is it going to be?
Okay, so as I said, I think Jeremy Hunt has given himself wiggle room to do an autumn statement, particularly if the OBR starts, has underestimated the strength of the economy. I mean, I was out last night in central London. I went to a sellout show, and then we tried 2 or 3 places, my wife and brother and nephew, to find a restaurant that was sold out, sort of you couldn't get into without having booked. So it appears to me, certainly in the London and the South East, that there is a buoyancy in the economy that, I always think economists should get out a bit and, look at the world. It might be better. They might do better than just looking at their spreadsheets. So if the OBR says, you've got a bit more room than we anticipated, don't be surprised if he puts in an autumn statement. And in that autumn statement, he would be looking to at least signpost some tax cuts. A number of different areas. It could be VAT on, VAT reclaims for foreign buyers, where the UK retail industry has been moaning about this issue. Could be the unfreezing of personal allowances, could be some cuts to IHT. I can see all of those potentially being on a Conservative list. If Rachel Reeves gets in, she will be screening her small print of what she's promised to see where she can squeeze more tax for the projects that Labour has proposed. I could see some reduction in the reliefs in IHT. I could see business asset disposal relief going. I could see some different surcharges on employers' national insurance happening. All of those sorts of things may well happen. A lot of it will depend on the sort of promises that she has to give. In terms of people may remember Blair's pledge cards about not increasing the basic or higher rates of tax, and indeed throughout the Labour period until the last month. I mean, talk about cynicism. They didn't raise the highest rate of tax. In the last month of their 13 years, they did. So it does depend to a certain extent on how circumscribed she is. Now, governments can always find ways of raising money by reducing allowances or getting rid of special regimes. So FHL is one of them, non-dom is another, and that finds you a bit of money. But the difference is how you spend it. And the Conservatives, I suspect, will be under considerable pressure to reduce the tax liability. That graph I showed you with tax as a percentage of GDP being, the highest it's been since 1948, is a source of continuous embarrassment to a Conservative Prime Minister and Conservative Chancellor. So I think there will be pressure to reduce that. From the Labour point of view, I think there would be more focus on public services. And although the the Conservatives gave a pretty substantial amount of money to the NHS to modernise their AI systems and so on. You can imagine that after what would be 15 years, there would be pressure on them to spend on areas of public services, indeed bail out some of the local authorities that are saying they're going bankrupt. So I could see that being different. If I was to look 5 years out, if the Conservatives get in, I think that they would look to spend most of the proceeds of any recovery and growth on tax cuts, if they could. And I think the Labour Party may make some tax cuts, very, very limited, I would have said, and are more likely to spend the proceeds on looking at elements on public services. And the electorate will then make their choice.
Very good. Thank you very much, Jeremy. All that leaves me to say then is thank you very much to the very, very large number of people that have taken time out of their Friday mornings to join us all this morning. Thank you to you, Jeremy, and thank you to Helen and Caroline in the background for keeping the this K3 Hub webinar and show on the road. I wish you all a great weekend.
Thank you very much.